Okay, Boker Tov. We left off in Shemuel Bet in the middle of chapter 3. We're up to Pasuk 28, Pasuk Kafchet. In the Rabbi Sachs Hebrew English, it's page 725 on the top. So just to refresh our memory, what we've seen so far, David has the challenge of trying to unite the kingdom under his rule. After Shaul passed away, there's still a bit of tension, a tug of war between the camp of Shaul and his son Ishbosheth, who was instituted in a puppet regime by his chief advisor, his chief officer Avner, and they were pulling in one direction for Shaul and his dynasty to maintain its rule, while David, who was truly the anointed one by Shemuel, is stepping into the limelight and is ready to take over. And so there's tension between Avner and Yoav. Yoav is David's chief general. We saw that, the play fight. Leave that on the side now. And so Avner was still trying to hold on to Ishbosheth, the son of Shaul, maintaining his grip on the melucha, on the kingdom. Of course, we then saw that Ishbosheth and Avner got into tension between them. Ishbosheth accused Avner of sleeping with his father's concubine, and that set Avner off, who was really kind of looking for an excuse to part ways from the camp of Shaul anyway, because he realized they were losing. And Avner does a total 180 and starts to come over to David's side of things. He pledges allegiance to David. He has a meeting with David. He tells David, I can help you to unite the kingdom. I can get the tribe of Binyamin. I can get the elders. And David accepts and trusts him. Avner follows through on his promises. And David and Avner are getting along with each other. And David thinks this is the opportunity that we've been waiting for finally to unite the kingdom under my rule.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
He's asking me, is there...
I can't get the internet working. I apologize. I've tried it a few times, but the internet seems to be struggling with me. So it's not working. I feel bad. It's not working. I'm not even getting any kind of connection. Sorry. I'll send her the recording, hopefully. So where were we? Right. So Yoav, though, has beef with Avner, because Avner, in the play fight, killed Yoav's brother. And so Yoav is not happy when he hears of David accepting Avner into his camp. He accuses Avner of deceiving David, to which David does not respond anything outright. Yoav then takes it upon himself to lure Avner back in to the city. He pulls him aside and he kills him. And now David has a big problem. This is where we left off with. David has a big problem because he took Avner in. Avner was going to give him the keys to uniting his kingdom together. And now his chief general, Yoav, very deceptively killed Avner. And David now has to separate himself from this act because it's going to be assumed by most people that David was the mastermind behind this plot to pretend that Avner was on his side, get everybody together, and then whack Avner and get him out of the way, and now everything's good, right? And the people are going to very much not be happy with that. They're going to rebel against David if that's the case. So David's got an issue here. He really saw the light of day that he could have united the kingdom. Now Yoav does something on his own. David has to distance himself from the actions of Yoav. And so we're going to see from now to the end of the chapter 4 different things that David does to make it abundantly clear to the people that he had no part in the murder of Avner, and that it was solely Yoav working on his own accord who killed Avner. Okay? So that's where we're up to in Pasuk 28, Kafchet, Vayishma David. Pasuk says, Vayishma David me'aharechen. David heard after what happened, Vayomer, and he said, Naki anochi umamlachti me'im Adonai ad olam. Me and my kingdom are clean. We're naki from before God for all eternity. Mideme Avner ben Ner, from the blood of Avner ben Ner. He makes a public statement that he was not responsible for the death of Avner. Yachulu al rosh Yoav. This should only be placed upon the head of Yoav. ve'el kol bet aviv, and on his father's house. Ve'al hikaret mi bet Yoav zav umetzora umahazik bapelech ve'nofel b'cherev v'hasar lev. David places a curse upon Yoav and his family. He says, may it fall upon the head of Yoav and all his family. May Yoav's household never lack one who suffers from a discharge. Someone who's a zav is like someone who's tameh, someone who's having emissions, a very terrible thing. Or a leper, someone who has tsara'at. Or one who clings to a crutch, someone who has a handicap. Or a victim of the sword, or someone who's being killed, or one who lacks bread. In other words, at all times, somebody in the family of Yoav is going to experience one of these tragedies. Either physical pain, suffering, illness, famine, hunger, or death. David places a heavy curse on Yoav and his family over the murder of Avner. Ve'Yoav ve'Avishai ahiv haregu le'Avner. Now the text tells us that Yoav and his brother Avishai, who was once a partner with David, remember David and Avishai back in Shemuel Aleph went down to the camp of Shaul when he was sleeping, and Avishai wanted to kill Shaul and David stopped him. We saw Avishai was a hot-headed guy. Well, this hot-headedness definitely came out again in the murder of Avner. Yoav and his brother Avishai killed Avner. Al asher hemit et Asael achihem begivon b'milchama. For the fact that that Avner killed Asael, their brother, in Givon in battle. So notice the connotation of the text over here. The text is telling us two things. Number one, Yoav's and Avishai's murder of Avner was vengeance. That was their motivation. Even though Yoav pretended to tell David, oh, he's tricking you, he's playing a double agent, that's not what Yoav was motivated by. That's what he was telling David. But he was motivated by vengeance for his brother's death, for his brother's murder. But the second thing is the text seems to lean on the side of favoring Avner in this situation. Because it says that Yoav killed Avner deceptively, because Avner killed Asael b'milchama, in battle. So who's justified there? When you kill somebody in battle, if you make a war, that's what's going to happen. Things like that are going to take place. Avner had no choice, and we saw Avner had a tremendous amount of restraint at first, trying to avoid killing Asael. Asael wouldn't buy it. He chased after Avner as part of the war. So Avner killed him in the throes of battle. Yoav and Avishai killed him in a deceptive way behind the gate in the middle of the night. That was a premeditated assassination, which is very different than killing somebody in battle. So the text seems to be saying what Yoav and Avishai did was a terrible crime. And that's why David is not happy about it. Yes?
I hear all that, but I'm having trouble with Avner was not a good guy.
No, Avner had his issues, and we're going to see that David is going to lament his death, but not from the standpoint of his character, right? It's more of a political thing than anything else. But Avner was trying to turn over a new leaf. He was trying to come over to David's side of things, maybe not for the purest of motivations necessarily, but David was going to take advantage of what Avner brought to the table and hopefully use him to help his kingdom flourish. And Yoav, in their temper, did something terrible. So
Yoav's crime doesn't even seem to be so much the murder. It seems to be that he's not in favor of uniting everybody.
Definitely, he allowed Yoav's issue, he allowed his own personal agenda to get in the way of what David could have wanted to do on a grander scale. In other words, David, you would imagine David saying something to Yoav like, I understand you wanted to take revenge for your brother's death, but you ended up thwarting our bigger plans. Your short-sightedness got us into trouble now in terms of how we're going to go long-term in getting the rule under David, right? Additionally, I think the deceptiveness of Yoav's actions is also something that David has a hard time accepting. David wants to build his kingdom under the tenets of honesty, of chesed, of kindness, and the ideas of taking revenge and deceptively murdering somebody stand in opposition to everything that David and his kingdom seek to stand for.
In what way Avner not a good guy?
He was supporting Shaul.
Well, Avner was supporting Shaul, and he was purposefully doing things to undermine what he knew was the rightful rule of David. Avner certainly knew it, because later when he comes to join David, he says, David, I'm going to help you fulfill the nivu'ah, the prophecy that you're going to be king. Which means Avner knew the prophecy. He knew that Shaul's kingdom should not endure. And yet, to maintain his power, because he was on the side of Shaul, he selfishly continued to pull the kingdom apart by supporting Ishbosheth when he should have supported David in the first place. Right? He waited until basically he had leverage against David to come over to David's side and then say, okay, now give me a position of power, let me be part of your thing. And Avner was the one who suggested the play fight, which broke out into hundreds of people dying. So Avner has had his issues as well, for sure. Let's continue on. So step one of David was to make a clear public statement. He was not involved in the murder of Avner, and he curses Yoav and his family to show that there's a distance between him and this crime. Second thing he does now is he declares a public sign of mourning over the murder of Avner. Verse 31. Vayomed David el Yoav ve'el kol ha'am asher ito. David tells Yoav, who was the murderer, by the way, as well as all of the people in his camp, Kira'u bigdechem, tear your garments, v'higru sakim, and put on sackcloth. These are classic signs of grief. V'siftu lifnei Avner, and eulogize over the murder of Avner. V'hamelech David holech ahar hamita, and the king David walked behind the coffin, which is a common practice of people who are relatives, who are lamenting the loss of an individual. Now the rabbis are adamant here about how far David went, because the rabbis say, typically the law is that when a person passes away, no matter how high profiled he may be, even a relative of the king is not to leave the palace. The king is not to leave the palace. He has a responsibility to the people, but first and foremost, before even his own relatives. So just the same way that the Kohen does not leave the Bet HaMikdash to stop his service from somebody who passes away, so too the king does not leave his palace ever to go and for the purposes of mourning the loss. He does not do this. So the rabbis actually questioned David. They said, I'll show you the halakha over here. Where is it? I'm in, here it is. It's a Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin. The Gemara says, met lo met, if the king lost a relative, eno yotze mi petach palterin shelo. He does not leave his royal chambers to mourn over the person who passed away. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he learns it from David. He says, Im rotze latzet achar hamita, if the king desires to walk behind the coffin, yotze, he may do so. Sheken matzinu beDavid, as we found by David himself, sheyatza ahar mitato shel Avner, who walked behind the coffin of Avner during his funeral procession. Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, v'hamelech David holech ahar hamita. So Rabbi Yehuda wanted to learn from here that a king does have the license if he chooses. It's optional for him to leave the palace and be part of the funeral procession. The rabbis responded to Rabbi Yehuda, Amrulo, they said to him, no, you're wrong. The lo haya hadavar, really David did not have permission to do that. The only reason why he did it was lefayes et ha'am, to appease the nation. In other words, David saw this as a need. This was an exception to the rule. The general rule is the king should not leave his palace to be part of the funeral procession. But David said, if I don't leave the palace to be part of the funeral, people will accuse me of being the one who ordered the Avner's murder. So to remove any suspicion and any connection to him, David broke the law, broke the rule. He found it, and he has the right to do that as a king, because it's an exception to the rule to say, I need to go out. If not, chaos will ensue in my empire. So this transcends the regular law. Fascinating. So David breaks the general rule of the king to be a part of Avner's funeral procession. Verse 32, back in the text, Vayikberu et Avner behevron. They buried Avner in Hebron, which is high praise. Hebron is the city of our fathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. He buries him in Hebron. Vayisa hamelech et kolo, the king raised his voice in sadness. Vayefk el kever Avner, and he cries upon the grave of Avner. Vayivku kol ha'am, and the entire nation cries over Avner's death.
Sincerely, he was crying. Who knows?
But I would say I have no reason to suspect not sincerely, to the extent that it may have been somebody else more on a higher. Is it the same as Shaul and Yonatan and those? I'm going to argue in a minute. No. So to that, but I don't think it was totally crocodile tears. Like I don't think that either. What?
Maybe a little overkill.
David feels like there's nothing that needs to be overkill over here, because you're going to see it's not until the end that the people finally accept it. Even this wasn't enough, because this could be staged, it could be whatever. Even this wasn't enough. Let's take a look at 33, verse 33. David goes to another step. He laments, he does a kina, a lamentation, a song upon the death of Avner. Remember, he did this in the first chapter of our book of Shemuel Bet, a lamentation over the death of Shaul and his best friend Yonatan. Vaikonen hamelech et Avner vayomar. The king broke out in lamentation over Avner and said, Hakemot naval yamut Avner. Did Avner deserve to die the same death as Naval? Remember who Naval was. Naval was that guy who refused to support David and help David when David had helped him and his shepherds for a very long time. David asked, can you just give us a little bit of food? Naval said, who are you? I'm not coming. And eventually Naval died. God killed him. And David married his wife, Abigail, Eshet Naval HaKarmeli. Naval dies a very disgraceful death. David says, should Avner die the same type of death as Avner, being tricked and killed in a deceptive way? This is not the way David would have hoped for someone of Avner's dignity to have gone out. He says in verse 34, Yadecha lo asurot. He says, your hands were not bound. Veraglecha lo nenehushtaim hugashu. And your feet were not fettered. Kinfol lifne bene avla nafalta. Yet you fell as one falls before violent men. In other words, what did you do to deserve this? Your hands were not tied, your feet were not shackled, and yet you died amongst people who were violent. He calls Avner and his posse violent people for having killed him. Vayosifu kol ha'am livkot alav. And all the people continued to weep over the loss of Avner. So that's number 2. Now what do you notice about David's lamentation? A couple of things. He doesn't really say anything about Avner's character necessarily. That's not what he's lamenting. What he's lamenting is the manner in which Avner's life was taken from him. That's really what David is expressing, that Avner did not deserve to die in the way that he did. And that's David making a public statement once again to everybody. I would have never suggested killing Avner in this type of a way. If anybody suspects me of having plotted this murder in this type of a way, understand that this did not come from me, because that's not appropriate in my eyes. A second thing that you notice is his lamentation is very short. It's not a whole lot there, just speaking about Avner and the way he died. A third thing that we notice how the text opens, Vaikonen hamelech. The king lamented him. If you go back a couple of chapters when David lamented Shaul and Yonatan, it says Vaikonen David. It gives him his name. What's the difference between Vaikonen David versus Vaikonen Hamelech?
Well, now he's the actual king. He's acknowledged as the king.
Okay, so if one could be that it just happens to be David's status, that he's acknowledged as the king, but yet there is still a little bit of rockiness. David's going to go up against some other people still, so it's not 100%.
More personal. When he's David, it's more personal. As the king, it's not as personal.
Excellent. That's, I think, what they're conveying, right? Vaikonen David is offering a personal lamentation because of the relationship that he had with Shaul and Yonatan. Despite Shaul trying to kill him, David ultimately was Shaul's son-in-law. He had moments of great relationship with Shaul. And of course, Yonatan was his best friend. So David can lament their character, and he's lamenting on a personal side. Here, when David laments Avner, it's not in a personal connection. They didn't have a good personal relationship. It's more from a political perspective. Hence, the text says, Vaikonen Hamelech, the king, from his perspective as king, laments over Avner and the way he was murdered. So sometimes, this is a good technique to always remember, sometimes the description that the text gives can often give us a window into the perspective of where the individual is coming from when he's making his statements or his actions.
So he's basically saying, it's not that Avner didn't deserve to die, it's that Avner didn't deserve to die in this manner.
Correct. And I would have never plotted this type of a thing as well. So if he got his due from Hashem, so be it. But for me to have done this, impossible. I would not have done it. And Avner was good with me politically, basically, at this point. Final thing that happens, so step 3, so far we've seen 3 things. David made a public statement. He cursed and cursed Yoav and his family for doing this action. He declared a national mourning and walked in the funeral procession. And 3, he did a public lamentation for Avner. Step 4 is he declares a fast. Verse 35. Vayavo chol ha'am lehavrot et David lechem be'od hayom. The entire nation came to eat bread with David on that day. So the word lehavrot is an important word. The first meal that mourners eat when they come home from the cemetery is after burying a relative is called seudat havra'ah. It's called the meal of havra'ah. Havra'ah almost comes from the language of bari, like healthy, like a meal that you do to acknowledge that you're healthy, but that the other person had passed away. It's a very emotional meal. That's the meal where we sit on the floor and you eat the egg and the bread. That's the first meal that mourners have after going through this surreal experience of burying a loved one. So it says that the people came to accompany David and eat bread with him in this Seudat Havra'ah post the burial of Avner. Vayishava David lemor. And at that moment, David swore out in public, Ko ya'aseh li Elohim v'cho yosif. God shall do this to me and he shall add on to me. Meaning that's a language of I swear and I should be punished. If what? Ki im lifnei bo hashemesh et am lechem o kol me'uma. If I should eat or taste anything until the sun sets. Now, generally speaking, it's not appropriate for a person to fast the remainder of that day. It's appropriate for them to eat that meal. But David says, impossible for me, given the grief that I've experienced and what's gone on, impossible for me to sit down and eat the Seudat Havra'ah. I declare publicly that I shall be fasting the remainder of the day. I refuse to eat anything. God should strike me and punish me if I should eat anything the remainder of this day. After all has been done, finally the text tells us, V'chol ha'am hikiru. Everybody finally recognized. Vayitav be'enehim. And it was good in their eyes. Kechol asher asah ha'melech. Based on everything that the king had done, be'eneh kol ha'am, in the eyes of the people, tov, was good. Verse 37, Vayed'u kol ha'am. At that moment the people knew. V'chol Israel, and all of Israel, bayom ha'hu, on this day, Ki lo hayta mehamelech lehamit et Avner ben Ner, that there was nothing in the king's heart to murder Avner ben Ner. So after all this that he had done, right? Finally, the people recognized, okay, the king is obviously very sincere. He must not have done this act. It was obviously a vigilante act on the part of some individuals, namely Yoav, to go and to kill Avner. So that's where David stands. I want to share with you an interesting idea that the Midrash says on that word lehavrot. Go back to verse 35, where it says the people came lehavrot. Now, in our text, it doesn't have it, but there is something called a kri uchtiv. Anybody know what a kri uchtiv means sometimes? Liz?
Read it one way and say it another way.
Excellent, good. There are some words in the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketubim, where they're written one way according to our tradition, but they're read a different way according to our tradition. And what that allows for layers of interpretation. Because if it's written one way, that means it means something one way in the written way. versus how it's read means something else. And it allows for layers of interpretation. Now, it happens to be here on the word lehavrot. We don't see in our tradition, in our text, that there was any way to read it and write it differently. However, there is a midrash that may have gone back very far, that I guess fell out of recognition or whatnot, that actually had a kri uchtiv over here, that had this word lehavrot written and read in two different ways. That it was read lehavrot, but it was actually written instead of a bet with a chaf, lehachrot. Now, bet and chaf are very similar looking letters, very easily interchangeable, but the meaning is very different. Lehavrot means the people came to eat together with David this mourner's meal. What does the word lehachrot mean? To cut him off. Lehachrot et David. The people came to kill David, to cut him off. So this is a genius midrash.
How would you add lechem to that?
No,
David lechem?
No, obviously it wouldn't make sense, but the point being that it's basically saying the people came there for one of two things. The people were still suspicious of David, and they came ready. If David didn't show the proper level of contrite behavior, they came ready to cut David off, to say, you're not our king. We refuse to accept your rule if you could do something like this.
His troops.
No, these are the people.
But the troops are...
Not all of them. Some of them are people from Avner's troops. Some people are loyal to Yoav and what he did. And this is just the general populace. The general populace does not want a king who can deceptively take vengeance against somebody in this way. They refuse to allow it. And they obviously looked at Avner as an upstanding person. So the people came there still not convinced. They came for two possible things. Lehachrot, to cut off David, or lehavrot. And so David still feels the need to do this act of fasting to show the people that he's sincere. And because he does that, that's why the people lehavrot. They end up eating with him and accepting him. But they were prepared, potentially, if David didn't show the proper level of remorse, lehachrot, to cut David off. So this really was a moment in which David's potential kingship hung by a thread. If David did not handle this situation with wisdom, and perhaps he had God's divine hand assisting him to give him that wisdom, if David didn't handle this situation right, it could have cost him his entire monarchy. And so David acts with wisdom and properly and holds on and is still now able to keep his grip on the kingdom and potentially unite them in the wake of Avner's murder.
What is it called again?
Kri uchtiv, right? Kri uchtiv means kri from the word likra, to read, ketiv from the word to write it. Yeah, exactly. You'll see this, there's almost every single page. If you turn your Tanakh, you'll see all the time, I mean, not every single page, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but you'll see almost, every so often, you'll see words in the margins that are written one way and spelt another way.
I noticed it a little in the Tehillim sometimes.
Yeah, in Tehillim also. It's in all books of Tanakh. In Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, you'll find that idea.
Yeah, I never get it, why it's there in Tehillim.
Right.
I never know which
So-
one I'm supposed to read.
No, so you're supposed to read, right, the one that has the vowels and that it says the Kri, that's the one you read. But it allows for multiple levels of understanding like we just illustrated.
So why would this be lost in the translation?
It's possible that after so many hundreds of years of reading something one way and doing things sort of by heart, that apparently the writing of this word, perhaps in a different way than it was read traditionally, was lost from us. Or maybe there was a debate amongst the members of the tradition as to whether this was a kri uchtiv, as it were. And that's not unusual, it's not uncommon for there sometimes to be debates about how to read words and how to write words based on tradition. Yeah. Let's read the last couple of Pisukim. David still does not address one major issue that still lingers. Okay, so David showed his unwavering support for Avner, how terrible it was that Yoav killed him. What if you were a person who wanted to see something happen? What would you expect at this point?
Yoav is no longer the...
There's got to be some kind of consequence for Yoav. Maybe Yoav needs to be put to death.
Cursed him and his family, that's...
So he did curse him, but is David going to maintain Yoav as part of his camp of Is he going to keep him in the position of chief officer? He should probably remove him at least from his post. Maybe even feel that he deserves to be sanctioned even more. We don't know. Something besides just an outside curse, jail, that something should happen. But David tells us why he doesn't do that. And he doesn't do that. So apparently that's not something that the people clamored for. And David explains to his servants, his people, his camp, why he doesn't. Vayomer hamelech el avadav. The king says to his subjects, Halo tedeu, you must also know, Kisar vegadol nafal hayom hazeh b'Yisrael, that a great officer and man has fallen today amongst Israel. Ve'anochi hayom rach umashuach melech. I today am a rach. Rach over here means soft, maybe vulnerable, something along those lines. How do they do it over here? They say, I'm a mild, umashuach melech, and just anointed king. V'ha'anashim ha'ele, and these men, bnei Seruya, the children of Seruya, that includes Yoav and his brother Avishai, kashim mimeni, they're tougher and stronger than me. Yeshalem Adonai le'oseh hara'a kera'ato. Let God pay back to those wicked the evil that they have done. So what does David say is the reason why he is not taking action against Yoav and the people who committed this terrible crime?
He's saying God will do it.
But why is he leaving it in God's hands? Why doesn't he do it himself? He says, I have to play this too also in a smart way. He's saying, A, I'm very vulnerable right now. My kingdom is not 100% united. The slightest act that I go too far could cost me my kingdom. I'm hanging by a thread. I myself, David admits, am maybe not the toughest of individuals. He's a compassionate king. He's a kind king. He's somebody who has a hard time invoking consequence against somebody. But maybe most importantly, Mashuach Melech, I am just anointed as king. And I need Bnei Seruya. I need tough people like this to be part of it. In other words, David does make a political calculation in the face of what maybe would have been the most moral thing to do. David says, I'm going to need these types of people to be in my corner. I need Yoav and his brother, the children of Seruya, who are tough as nails. I need those types of people with me. So it's enough that I cursed him, and the rest I'm going to leave in Hashem's hands. Hashem should do the evil, right? Well, Yoav is still going to act on behalf of David. He's still going to maintain his post, and he's going to try to work towards a goal in which David is the king. We will see that Yoav will play a very important role in helping David to found his kingdom.
Surprising that people would accept that.
They do. David plays a very important political calculation, and the people accept it. He's the king, right? So David has felt that he's done enough to handle the situation. Remember, Avner is not the greatest of individuals, but David needs Yoav. He needs him, and we'll see that Yoav is going to come up in many stories in which his support for David is critical to David's maintaining his kingdom.
Physically,
Physically and everything else. What's so interesting is that at the end of his life, when David is about to pass away, he tells his son, Shlomo, you take care of him. And Shlomo will do it. Shlomo will kill Yoav through his messenger, a man by the name of Benayahu ben Yehoyada. He does it through him. Even though Yoav is holding on to the Mizbeach, which is like a safe haven. When a person holds on to the altar, you really can't kill them. Shlomo says, kill him while he's holding on to the altar. He deserves to die. And so he is brutally punished by Shlomo, but David tells him to do it, and he knows why he's doing it. And Yoav will have a back and forth relationship with David, but David ultimately tells him, I can't be the one to do it. For whatever reason, David is unable to do it. He needs Yoav. There's what's it called? The love-hate relationship over here between David and Yoav, and therefore he's going to leave that dirty work to his son Shlomo to go ahead and take care of after David has already passed away. What was one of those I saw over here? One of those stories I think they bring over here. Yeah, later on he's going to do it with Avshalom and other things. So he's going to play an important role. We're going to trace a little bit more of this as we go along. In chapter 10, we're going to get to a major point in which Yoav actually saves David in a major battle. And so we see that maybe that's the reason why. One last thing to talk about on this chapter before we try to do chapter 4 very quickly, because it's very short, is that one does have to ask the question, why did this happen to David? It's true, people have free will. They can act on their own. But nothing of this nature happens if not for the fact that somebody does something wrong. In other words, what did David do to have to need to wiggle out of this situation? You understand my question? Like, why is it that Yoav acted this way? Of course, he acts with free will, but nothing ever happens in that manner without it being somewhat divinely orchestrated. That David should need to wiggle out of this situation means that David may have misstepped slightly in the course of this action.
It goes back to the time when he tore the coat.
Tearing the coat might be going back a little bit further. I want to suggest that there's something in this story as well.
When Yoav comes to him, he doesn't do anything?
Good. I think that's the problem. I think it was the fact that David did not adamantly handle Yoav to avoid Yoav acting on his own. When Yoav comes to David and says, oh, Avner tricked you and he's a double agent, and what did you do? At that moment, what David should have said was, how dare you speak about Avner? He's faithful, he's loyal, don't disregard what he said in the past. He's a part of us now. And had David said something like that, maybe that would have deterred Yoav a little bit more than what he did. Instead, Yoav is met with silence, which is deafening in this case, because it could suggest a few different things. A, maybe somewhere in the back of David's mind, he was still a little suspicious of Avner, so he couldn't fully endorse Avner publicly to Yoav, because maybe there was something there, and that false accusation on the part of David could have cost him. Or at the very least, he should have just done enough to rebuke Yoav so that Yoav did not act on his own. By keeping quiet, it allowed Yoav a moment, a gap, a void to fill by acting this way, to which then David had to do damage control to distance himself from it. Perhaps had he said something outwardly, he wouldn't have had to do that, and maybe the catastrophe wouldn't have happened in the first place. And so the lesson being that a person needs to be vocal sometimes about what things are going on, not leave their silence to potentially show that they are suspicious of another individual. Right? Yeah.
Maybe David recognizes that when he says, I'm sort of new at this and weak.
Yeah.
Yoav is a strong character.
Yeah.
And
he knows what, and I should have recognized what he was capable of doing by not being more forceful.
He'd done that in the past when he didn't trust his servants or his armsmen, whatever they called, to not harm the king,
right?
Shemuel, because
right.
Said, no, don't touch him.
Right.
You're not supposed to.
So here David didn't do enough in this situation, and so that's what maybe is working behind. The rabbis say something fascinating in the Gemara in Sanhedrin. They say that because of this, and this is pretty severe, all of the curses that David put upon Yoav ended up coming onto David. The rabbis say that Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Kol kelalot shekilel David, all of the curses that David put onto Yoav, nitkaimu bezar'o shel David. They ended up coming true on David's own children. Now, it also came true on Yoav's. But because David levied a harsh curse against Yoav, when he also needed to claim a level of responsibility for what took place, the rabbis say that David also, not coincidentally, endured much suffering with his children in the same fashion that he put that suffering onto Yoav. So there's another good lesson here, which is a person has to be very careful what he says about other people. The types of things that you say towards others have a way of boomeranging back to one individual, especially if the person himself is actually partially responsible for what took place. So sometimes we'll do something like that to show that we're 100% righteous when maybe we were only 99.9% righteous. And once you're only 0.1% and you levy a curse against somebody, you leave yourself open for that curse to boomerang back to oneself. Hopefully that should never happen. But as we will go through, we will see that the lineage of David, his children and his future kings, will have a tough go of it based on a lot of what happens in this curse. Okay, I think that's enough for chapter 3. We move to chapter 4. We have enough time here. Chapter 4 is short. It's 12 verses to potentially run through this next chapter. The next chapter tells us that despite everything that David did, there still was a ramification for the murder of Avner. And this is going to be people taking matters into their own hands. As Yoav did, we now have a vigilante culture going on. And once again, people are going to take matters into their own hands and murder somebody that they shouldn't have been murdered. And once again, David is going to have to stand up for the innocent victim who was murdered in this case, despite the fact that he may in fact be his enemy. Watch. Verse 4, Perek Daled, verse 1. Vayishma ben Shaul, the son of Shaul heard. Who's the son of Shaul? Ishboshet, right? That's that weak puppet king. Notice again that the text uses a somewhat derogatory term to refer to him. Instead of referring to him by his name, it calls him the son of Shaul heard. Meaning, again, this is not the greatest of individuals. What?
You're not really anybody.
Not anybody worthwhile, but David will consider him. Vayishma ben Shaul ki met Avner behevron, that Avner was murdered in Hebron. Vayirpu yadav, and he lost his grip. In other words, he was immediately frightened, right? Hey, this was the guy who I was a puppet king for the whole time. I'm done. And he basically, gets weak. V'chol Yisrael nivhalu, and all of the Jewish people became anxious. Verse 2. Ushne anashim, in response to this, 2 men, Sareg Gedudim, who were heads of leaders of raiding parties, hayu. Ben Shaul, Shem ha'ehad ba'ana v'shem ha'sheni rechav. So these 2 officers who were part of Shaul HaMelech's army, they were leaders of raiding parties. Their names were Ba'ana and Rechav. Bene Rimon, they were the sons of a man named Rimon, HaBe'eroti mi Bene Binyamin, who came from a place called Be'erot, which is amongst the people of Binyamin, which makes sense, because that's where Shaul's stronghold was. He was from the tribe of Binyamin.
They had names.
Yeah, but the king doesn't. These guys are much tougher. Ki gam Be'erot tehashev al Binyamin. He says because Be'erot is also considered a city in Binyamin. We're going to go back to that verse, why the text has to tell us, by the way, Be'erot is a city in Binyamin. Vayivrehu ha-Be'erotim Gitaima. All of the people who lived in Be'erot fled to a place called Gitaima, or really Gitaim. Vayusham garim ad hayom hazeh. And they lived there until this day. This is very strange. This is a lot of information that one wonders, why do we need to know this? Why is this important about where these people lived and what tribe they belonged to? Maybe, okay, we get it, Binyamin, and the fact that the people fled, like, what's going on over here? So there's a lot of, there's some suggestions prosed by the commentaries, but I like what Rav Avnon Bazak says. He says, even though the text seems to present these 2 people, Rechav and Ba'ana, as members of the tribe of Binyamin, which would make them Jewish people, right? He says, in reality, he wants to say that they were members of a nation called Giv'onim, Giv'on. And we know the people of Giv'on, they suffered a tremendous loss at the hands of Shaul. Shaul obliterated their people. So says Rabbi Amnon Bazak, you know what really took place? These people, Rechav and Ba'ana, they were members of the tribe of Giv'on. They were not Jewish people. And after Shaul had obliterated their nation, they hid out and lived within the cities of the tribe of Binyamin, because that's who conquered their cities. And now, after Avner died, these 2 guys got up and said, we want to take revenge against Shaul and his family. And they're going to be the ones to assassinate Shaul's son. So they took advantage of a chaotic climate in which Avner, the chief general, has been murdered. Ishboshet is clearly a weak man who is not someone fit to lead. And these 2 guys who were really Giv'onim, living amongst the tribe of Binyamin, take it upon themselves to seek the vengeance of their tribe by murdering Ishboshet, the son of Shaul. And that's what goes on in the coming verses. Verse 4. V'lihonatan ben Shaul ben neche raglayim. to Yehonatan, the son of Shaul, was a son who was handicapped, who was crippled. Ben Hamesh Shanim Haya Bevo Shemuat Shaul v'Yonatan mi'Yisrael. He was only 5 years old when the news of Shaul and Yonatan's murder in this battle against the Pelishtim reached him, Yisrael. Vatisaehu umanto vatanos, and his guardian, his omenet, his nurse or whatever, his female guardian, took him and fled and ran away. Vahi behovza lanus, and it was when she was so fast in running away, vayipol, he fell, vayipaseach, and he became a cripple. Ushma Mephibosheth, and his name was Mephibosheth. Now, for the perek we're about to read, this information is almost irrelevant. Mephibosheth is not going to come up. But basically, in the assassination of Ishbosheth, who will be the one to take over for him and potentially claim the next layer of the throne? It will be Yonatan's son, Shaul's grandson, Mephibosheth, who is, unfortunately, a cripple because he was fleeing after Shaul and Yonatan and his other brothers were killed in battle of the Pelishtim. Perhaps the two Givonim who are assassinating Ishbosheth knew of the crippled grandson and basically said, if we can only get rid of Ishbosheth, there's no chance this cripple is going to become the king. And we basically decimated the lineage of Shaul, because there's no way anybody will continue the legacy with this guy who's a cripple. The Givonim, again, want to avenge their tribe by destroying Shaul and his lineage. Okay, so what do? Pasuk Hey. Vayelechu b'nei Rimon ha'be'eroti Rechav u'Ba'ana, the sons of Rimon from Be'erot, Rechav and Ba'ana, vayavo kehom hayom, they come in the heat of the day, el bet Ishbosheth, to the house of Ishbosheth, v'hu shochev et mishkav hatzahorayim, and Ishbosheth is taking an afternoon nap. Not exactly the picture of greatness, right? Verse 6, v'hine ba'u ad toch habayit, they make their way in to the main part of the home. Lokehe hitim. This phrase is a very difficult one to understand. Most explain it that he walked in together with merchants of wheat, or they pretended maybe to be merchants of wheat. Do they say it over here? Yeah. It says they entered the inner part of the house as though to fetch wheat. In other words, they portrayed themselves as getting into the home to gain access to Ishbosheth's home, because probably he had some security around the home. They pretended that they were coming to drop off wheat or pick up wheat or something of that nature. So they gained access. And when they did, vayaku el hahomesh, they stabbed him in the stomach and killed him. Verechav u'Ba'ana ahiv nimlatu. And Rechav and Ba'ana, his brother, escaped. They ran away. So they assassinate the king. Now, verse 7 is odd because it repeats exactly what just happened. Vayavo habayit, they came into the home. V'hu shochev al mitato b'hadar mishkavo, and Ishbosheth was laying down in his bedroom, on his bed. Vayakuhu vaymituhu, and they hit him and killed him. Vayasiru et rosho, and they removed his head. Vayikhu et rosho, they took his head. Vayelechu derech ha'arava kol halayla, and they walked through the arava all night long. Now we'll see in a moment that their intention is to bring the head of Ishbosheth to David, to show David that he killed Ishbosheth. Why do you think they would do that?
Because he's against him. He just wants to be king.
Right. So who wants to be king?
Ishbosheth.
Ishbosheth is the foil to David. Right, so these guys are going to take his head to David to try and what? To try and gain favor with David. Exactly, right? The Givonim, who they're from, had a very hard time with Shaul and his lineage. They're going to try to take advantage of the fact that there's a new king in town and try to gain some favor with them so that David will not do the same thing to their people the way Shaul did to their people, right? That seems to be a second motivation that's going on over here. We'll leave that for just a moment. One has to ask, however, these two Pisukim are very strange in the way that they're formulated. If you go technical, the Tanakh just repeated exactly what it said in verse 6, again in verse 7, right? With just a couple of details added here and there. So what's going on over here? So some commentaries try to say that the first pasuk just told you that they killed him. And then the second pasuk gives us more detail about exactly how they did it. That's a little tough because really the Tanakh could have just combined the whole thing into one pasuk and just told it to us all the first time around. The Radak gives a second possibility. He says, you know what actually happened? They went back in. They came in, they quickly killed him, and they ran away. And then they said, hey, wait a minute. Let's get that. They said, no, really, they did that. Why? Because, in other words, these people really had two motivations. Really, there were two motivations going on. Motivation number one to kill Ishbosheth was vengeance over the family of Shaul. But then second motivation kicked in, which is, why not use this to our advantage and gain favor with the new king? So in other words, what you'd say is, in the Radak's eyes, they went in and they quickly just killed him and ran away because they didn't know if they were going to get away with it. They just wanted to make sure to exact the vengeance. And at that moment, they said to themselves, hey, why are we just running out of here without anything to show for our efforts? We did the vengeance part, but we could actually take advantage of this and use this to garner favor with the new king. Let's go back in, sever the head, and we'll take it to David, and when he sees that we killed Ishbosheth, he'll give us a great reward, and now we'll be in great standing with the new king. So the Radak is saying that the two Pesukim and the idea of going back in plays to the two different motivations these individuals, Rechav and Ba'ana, may have had to kill Ishbosheth. Now the only reason why they have the moxie, the gall, to even kill Ishbosheth is because of what? Is because of the murder of Avner, right? Had Avner not been murdered, likely Rechav and Ba'ana would not have done this. But the moment that happened, the floodgates open to now destroy and kill anybody within the Shaul camp, right? And so Rechav and Ba'ana seized that opportunity. And that's why this chapter is important coming off of the last one, because despite everything that David does, it nevertheless created a problem that opened up a Pandora's box for more murder to occur, which had it not happened, none of this would have potentially transpired. Now, David is going to have another issue. How is he going to react when these two individuals bring him the head of Ishbosheth?
He's going to sing another song.
He's going to sing another song. Not quite, not exactly. But one would have thought, potentially, if we didn't know David very well, what would have been the average reaction of a king to the fact that the head of his adversary is being brought to him? Unbelievable. Let's glorify these people. That's why they're doing it. They think, hey, this is a no-brainer. It's a slam dunk. When the king sees we killed his number one problem, his number one enemy, he's going to love us. What do we know about David?
That's not the case.
That's not who David is, right? Think about the beginning of the book, right? What happened in the beginning of the book?
Somebody brought him the sword.
Exactly, right? When the Amaleki brought him the crown and the weapon and the armor of Shaul and Yonatan, thinking that he was going to present it to him, and after he told him, I killed the king, at the king's request, mind you, by the way, and he's going to present it to David, that David is going to be in love with this guy. A, he fulfilled the request of the king. B, it's his number one adversary, and he's bringing back the crown. How did David treat that guy from Amalek? Boom, he killed him. David's going to do the same over here as well. He already set that precedent. David is saying, I'm not interested in the murder and vigilante revenge of my adversaries. God will take care of those adversaries. That's what he's been preaching consistently. David is about staying the course in morals and ethics. So what happens? Let's read it quickly in verse 8. Vayaviu et rosh Ishbosheth el David Chevron. These men bring the head of Ishbosheth to David in Chevron. Vayomeru el hamelech. They say to the king, thinking they're going to get a joyous response. Hine rosh Ishbosheth ben Shaul oyivcha. Behold, here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Shaul, your enemy. Now it's not clear if he's calling Shaul his enemy or if he's calling Ishbosheth his enemy. They're all enemies. Asher bikesh et nafshecha, who was seeking out your life. Vayiten Adonai ladoni hamelech nekamot hayom hazeh. Look, God has given us revenge for the master, our king, on this day. Mishaul umizar'o, from Shaul and from his lineage. Finally, we're done from the tension and issues related to Shaul and his people. Don't worry, Mephibosheth, that guy, he's nothing. He's a cripple, not an issue. Verse 9, Vaya'an David et Rechav et Ba'ana ahiv b'nei Rimon ha'be'eroti. David answers Rechav and Ba'ana, Vayomer lahem, and he says to them, Hi Adonai, I swear on God. Asher pada et nafshi mikol tzara, whom God was the one who redeemed me from all my sufferings. Verse 10, Ki hamagid li lemor. You seem to have forgotten what happened to the one who told me, Hine met Shaul, that Shaul had died. Vehu haya kimvaser be'enav. He was just giving me news, that guy. Ve'ohaza bo, and I grabbed him. Va'ahargehu b'tziklag, and I killed him in Siklag. Asher lititi lo besora, for the fact that he gave me the news. Just telling me the news already warranted him to be put to death. Av ki anashim resha'im haregu et ish tzaddik beveto al mishkavo. Now what do you think is going to happen to wicked people who kill a righteous person in his home, defenseless in his bed? What did Ishbosheth do? Ish tzaddik, he calls him, a righteous individual. By the way, because David knew Ishbosheth wasn't necessarily the one who was leading the charge against his kingdom. He was doing what any son would do who was being put into a puppet regime. All right, I got to defend the honor of my king. David didn't begrudge him a single bit. He calls him an ish tzaddik. Ve'ata halo avakesh et damo miyedchem. Behold, I shall request his blood from your hands. Ubi'arti etchem min haaretz, and I will destroy you from the land. Verse 12, Vaitzav David tane'arim. David commands his young lads, his arms bearers, Vayahargum, and they kill Rechav and Ba'ana. Vaikatzetzu et yedehem vet raglehem. They cut off their hands and feet as a sign of disgrace for them after doing what they did. Vayitlu al haberecha beheshbon, and hung them over the cistern in Hebron. In other words, he made an example of them. This is what happens to people who murder for no reason, who murder righteous people in claiming that they did the right thing. Ve'et rosh Ishboshet lakachu, the head of Ishboshet he took, vayikberu bekever Avner behevron, and they bury it in the grave of Avner in Hebron. So Avner and Ishboshet both suffer terrible endings and terrible fates. And in both cases, David does everything to show that he did not desire any of this. He is not somebody who is in favor of bloodshed and violence in the name of upholding his monarchy. Ironic, because those beneath him will try to enact bloodshed and violence against David and try to rebel against him, despite David's high moral standing. So these are some of the early challenges that David had to deal with politically and morally in lifting up and elevating and founding his early kingdom. Challenges will continue to ensue before he is fully put in. He is now basically recognized as the king, but there's still a bit of chaos and tumultuous issues going on that David is going to continue to have to navigate through as the chapters Be'ezat Hashem go on.
Why wouldn't they put his head with the rest of his body?
So I don't know what happened. I was looking at commentaries. Is there anything over there in yours, Esther? I was looking for some commentaries and I didn't find anybody talking about why didn't they go back to retrieve the body potentially. Maybe they did. Maybe they buried the body in one place and the head somewhere else. I'm not 100% sure. I had a hard time finding that. I'll do a little more research. If I come up with anything, I'll let you know. But I don't know. It seems the act of burying the head was enough of a sign of kavod on its own. I don't know what they did with everything else. Yeah. Yeah, potentially. Yeah. I don't know. I have to look into it a little bit more. I didn't see anything on it. I didn't see anybody ask the question. But if I find anything, I'll let you know. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.